Hey, good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 3. As I said yesterday, I was going to go over, even though we learned it, the paragraph in the middle of page 1475. So, yesterday I did a review of everything we learned till here. So just a short review to go into this paragraph is that from the perspective of Atzmus, where everything is one, but Atzmus chose two tracks, so to speak, that don't begin as two tracks. They all start in that ultimate seamless unity, but ultimately there will become, in order to fulfill the nesava, the desire that God has, to have a dira b'tachtenim, they will become two tracks. And one of them is Ohr, what he calls pnimius. The Ohr, like the teacher, that is expressing to himself, but it's an expression. Atzmus, remember, is beyond all expression, beyond revelation, beyond Gilu, beyond Helen. All that language doesn't apply there. But he wants to create an existence like ours. So the first thing is that there's the concept of divine expression, but that's beyond existence, even though that's also part of the creation of existence. And the second is an Ohr hashayach ala elamis, where the teacher in the example is applying himself to transmit these ideas that are his own toward and cater to and tailor to the makabel, the student. So initially, these are all within Atzmus, and that's what he calls the two levels of ayin, because that's what Hashem wants. It's not one level of ayin that when it's diminished, from that emerges the second level. It's the ayin of the yesh amiti and the ayin of the yesh hanivra. However, they begin together, and then is the tzimtzum, which is yet another force that God employs. And we discussed whether that force is one of these two levels. I suggested not, even though you could technically explain it's part of the second Ohr. But I would say here it's a level of tzimtzum, God's power to conceal. And what is he concealing? That unity, to allow these two tracks to emerge. It's the teacher that is allowing that we should now discern the Ohr, the energy that he's going to transmit to the student. So the tzimtzum creates the havdalah, as he says, the nikr v'nivdal, the hakara, the nikr and nivdal. You should be able to discern the second energy, which was encompassed in together with the first one, but then it was all part of one unity. So now you have, and it was all hakol b'chinas Ohr echad, like he says. And when it was that level, which we called chitzenius, was part of the pnimius. They were all together as one. Hakol miyuchad mamish batzmusi is barach. Achai de'at tzimtzum nivdol v'nifresh hachitzenius min hapnimius. So in order to create an existence like ours, we need to have a certain independence that we don't feel that unity, or else the whole purpose of existence is not going to happen. To have tachtenim, which means an existence that is where the divine is concealed, as the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya chapter 36. That's where you need the tzimtzum. Our job, which he doesn't say right here, but it's clearly the whole theme and message of Ayin Beis and Chassidus in general, is to reveal the divine even after the tzimtzum, to trace our way back. Firstly, to recognize that the Ohr that is coming to us is also originated in Atzmus, and then trace our way back to before the tzimtzum, to the point where they both are two energies coming from one place, to the point they're united all together, and even to the point where we understand from the perspective of Atzmus, these are two deis, Kael Deis Havaya, they're really one. But that requires Avodah. That's the Avodah of Dira B'Tachtein. But initially, the existence is created with the tzimtzum. That's Bereshis, Bara, Elokim, as we read in this week's chapter, Parsha. Elokim, Midas Hadim, Midas HaTzimtzum. And that allows, like we learn, continue learning, that day one was Yehi Ohr. The Medrash says, Yom Echad, what radiated was Achdus. And day two, Hashem separated by Yavdel. Separation is also considered a Tzmtzum separation, but not that, God forbid, there's a duality. Is that in order to create existence, you need to separate between the higher and the lower, between water and land, to create the distinctions, to create the diverse multitude of existence. And the goal is that Adam and Chava, created on the sixth day, and Rosh Hashanah, should reunite everything. And the Yoda called Paul Ka'ata Pa'alta, to recognize the divine within everything. Yes, the ayin of the Yesh HaNivra, Bitl HaYesh, and from that to climb to Bitl B'Mitzias, Yechudi Allah, and from there to climb to the third, ultimate Atzmus, where both are one. Because the same Atzmus that wanted the higher level of Ohr also wants the Ohr that goes into existence. However, initially, it's all encompassed as one. The Tzimtzum separates, and our Aveda is to reconnect. Again, he doesn't mention the Aveda here, but he will. Not Ayin Beis, because Ayin Beis will end very shortly. But he has discussed it at length earlier, especially in volume 2 and in volume 3. So right now the focus is on the process itself of these different deis, Das Tachten, Das Elyon, Yechudi Allah, Yechudi Tato, Yechudi Allah, and their union, the union of these two. In using the language on page 1466, that the Yichud Kutsha B'richa V'Shchinta Shezeu Yisei Kol Teira Mitzvah, Kol HaMitzvahs. And then he says, furthermore, not just there's two Yechudim, just want to see the actual language where he says, and also to unite these two, which are indicated in Shema and Baruch Shem Kved Malchusei Lo Olam Va'ad, or in Hashem Elokeinu and Hashem Echad. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu and Hashem Echad, also these two levels. So it's really three levels in a sense. So I'm summing up again what we've learned, and now let's continue reading the next paragraph, which we have already learned, but we'll learn it again now. So he says like this. Tell you the truth, I said I would review it. I didn't have time to review what I had said before Sukkot in the previous class, so we'll work it through. So he says now like this. V'hinei. This is the new paragraph on page 1475, and the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. V'hinei zeu b'chinas klolos ha'er hashayach le'elemes. That which we just spoke about, that the Tzimtzum separates between the higher and the lower, between the Pnimius and the Chitzenius. This is the klolos ha'er hashayach le'elemes. V'hainu. What does that mean? The Pnimis we spoke about is the Ohr that's completely removed. It's a transcendent Ohr, which has purpose as well. Its purpose is to create bittul. We learned in volume 1. I discussed that as well in the previous classes. That's one level. And in general, that's Sev of Kalalman, the Ohr stuff which is transcendent and removed from existence. And its root is an Ohr Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. And the second is V'achitzenis u'b'chinas ha'er ela elemis. Ha'er shela elemis. The Chitzenis is the Ohr that God initially, from the outset, established that would be dedicated to create existence. Like when we say Yehi Ohr, Yehi Rakia, which is the B'derech Klal Zeh b'chinas Mamala Kalam. That's in general Mamala Kalam. Omnam, however, says the Rebbe Rashab, that is the general picture of Pneumis and Chetzenis. But here, Kan HaKavone, Ba'ir V'agilish Shebe'elmis, Sheyez B'zeh Beis Madregas. That it's not just there's a level that's beyond existence and a level in existence, that the intention is in the Eir V'gili, in Elimis, there's two levels. Ha'echad, B'chinas Ha'gili, B'chinas Iskalus B'atzmusei Adayim. One is a level which is still, as it's encompassed in Atzmusei, like an example of the teacher, the Mashpia, that even though he has an oir that is not discernible yet. It's not obvious yet. That it's for the makabel, but it's included within him, and it's not there. It's not. You can't distinguish it. It's a scholar's batzmusei adai. Va'beis is the next step where the teacher says, "Okay, now I will prepare that seichel to transmit to this makabel, to this recipient." Va'beis b'chinas says gala shachutz latzmusei li'ez b'chinas makal liyesh. So, in other words, he's saying that both of these is a ervigili be'elamis. In other words, we have access to both of them. It's not that one is completely removed and one is we can relate to. That in existence you have both of them. However, one is a level of the divine that's on God's terms, and the other is the godliness that's on our terms. And he explains now what that means. Va'inyan hu. Going back to the classic 20th epistle, the 20th section in the Geras HaKedesh in Tanya. So he says there about be'inyan the iyu v'garmu echad. So there he talks about the question that he asked there. Iyu v'chayu echad, you can understand that iyu, God, you are one with your eris, as he explains there. Chayui is God's divine energy. But Garmui goes on the Kalim. So how do we say that is chad with the Kalim? The Kalim are already a structured divine structure. So what does it mean that he's chad? So he says the unity means livrei bahem v'al yodam, that these are God's instruments to create bahem, in them, v'al yodam, and through them. Ma'ayin liyesh. So in other words, the Eris and Kalim serve as a role, in a sense, similar to what we just spoke about. Where the Oir is the energy of the divine energy. The Kalim is Yehi Oir, Yehi Rakia. All the words that God uses. And I don't just mean words, I mean here all the definitions that God uses to create existence. By definition, that means that they have distinction. They are the instruments through which God creates. In other words, if God would just create with Oir and no Keli, what you'd have is, it wouldn't make sense with our seichel, because Oir is pshitis, Oir is seamless, is shapeless, relatively speaking. It's the Kalim that allow us to understand how that divine energy is channeled into a distinct world. We look around the world, what do we see? We see trees, we see birds, daimim, tsemeya, chai medaber, millions, billions of different species, trillions of cells, and one different than the other. And that's not an illusion. Their difference is part of creation. That's why there's a difference between Shabbos and Chayil. There's a difference between an animal and a human being. Like we say at the end of by Havdalah, Lahavdil ben v'cheshach, Yisrael la'amim, v'yem hashvi l'sheish yimei ha'maisa. Havdalah is part of God's creation. He wants distinction. He wants us to come and take the diverse world and turn it into one, directed toward one, to the oneness of godliness, to reveal yichud, the divine unity within the diversity of existence. But there is diversity. So Kabbalah, the Kabbalists explain, Chassidus elaborates, that's where, if you want to understand the process, God says, I'll take my Oir. My Oir is divine expression. That's like the ideas of an author. And I'll put them into words, into Kalim, so the recipient can understand what I'm saying. Imagine the Torah was just, we say, v'shashuim lefonov. It's God's delights. The Torah as it is in its makir will not be understood by us. So God took the Torah and put it into words. And no nafshi ksovis yahavis, he instilled himself in those words, holy words, but they're words. We read Bereshis, Bara, Lakim, Esa Shamayim, Esa Aretz, and the entire Torah is made up of structure, but it's a divine structure. So the Kalim is what God uses, Bahem, Val Yodam, to create existence. And with these words, he creates. Now, could God call the Kol Yachol, Almighty God can do anything he wants, but as we've discussed so many times, but he wants a dir b'tachtenim, he wants us to be part of the process. He wants us to understand it, to relate to it, to connect with it, to unite with it, and to do our work. So the kelim, therefore, iyu v'garmu yichad, that you, God, are one also with your kelim, not just with your edus. Because the kelim are also God. In the language we're using here, the oir, not just the oir la'atzmai, but also the oir hashayich la'elamis. The oir shala'elamis is also iyu v'garmu yichad. The b'chinas iyu is b'chinas oir pnimi. In this case, what is iyu? Is the oir pnimi that manifests in the containers, hamislabish ba'kelim, that manifests inside the containers, and that iyu, that oir is one with the kelim through which the instrument. If you think of it like I said, an author, same thing with an artist. He has his paintbrush. He has his idea of what he wants to paint, but imagine he doesn't have a paintbrush. How is he going to get his concept onto a canvas? So he has kelim. Now, obviously, with a human being, the keli is not one with the artist. It's outside of him. But the case of the Eibishter, the kelim are also divine. So God created instruments, divine instruments, with which he's going to shape and define existence, the structure of existence. So the EU is Mislabish B'Kelim, and he now spells out what level is that? The B'chinas Ha'era Mislabish, the B'chinas Malchus, the B'chinas Mokel Lahavas. This Oyer that already manifests in Malchus, and we already learned earlier, that's not the Oyer of Zah of Atzilus. Definitely not Chachman Bina, definitely not higher than Atzilus. Malchus is already relating to existence. It's channeling and funneling the energy, the higher levels of Atzilus, into becoming a creative force. So Za'ir is Meslabish and Malchus, B'chinas Mokel Lahavis. In the parentheses, the Rebbe Rashab qualifies and says, Uba Mokel Macher. And elsewhere it says, Shazel B'chinas Yichud Zoh Malchus, that this is a Yichud. Elsewhere it says, he said here is the Oyer in the Keli, or the Oyer in Malchus, that's the Yichud of Zoh and Malchus. The Iyu is El B'chinas Zoh. In the other place it says that Iyu is the level of Zoh, not just the level of Oyer in general. Hainu B'chinas Ha'Oyer de Zoh, not the Kem, the Oyer of Zoh. U'b'terech Klal B'chinas Zoh Ikrei B'chinas Eres. And in general, Zoh, especially in relation to Malchus, is the level of Eres. U'kumoisha Zoh Rubich Sodim. Like we say, Zoh, even though it has Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, Chod, Yesod, it consists of 6 emotions, but the primary dominant one is Chsodim. And Chsodim in general relates to Oyer. Gvura generally relates to Tzmtzum, to Miyut, diminishment. So this is referring to Oyer of Zoh, Shemisyachid in B'chinas HaMalchus. That's the Iyu V'garmu Yichad, that Zoh, the Oyer of Zoh, is Misyachid, the Iyu, with the Garmui, which is Malchus Lahavis, Ma'ayin Liyesh, to create Ma'ayin Liyesh. So what he's explaining here is essentially explaining what we learned till now, the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra. So this is already a level of Oyer after the Tzimtzum that's separated and allows this Oyer to manifest Oyer Pnimi, the source of Mamala Kalaman, Oyer Pnimi into the Kelim, more specifically Zoh into Malchus, the Oyer of Zoh into Malchus. And the parentheses, as indicated down below in the footnote, ends here, after Liyesh Chulu. Okay. So continuing on, and then we'll sum up this whole piece. And this is the very purpose of the evolution, or the process, the ishtalshlus, the chain, the process, the chain of events, if you wish, of the Esespheres of Atzilus. That's the role of Atzilus, to take the Oyer that the Mashpia has designated and dedicated to the Makabel, and to slowly, or the word slowly maybe is not the right word, but to step by step break it down, level by level, from level to level, from Chochmah to Bina to Das to Netzach to Chesed, Gvura to Feres, Netzach, Chod, Yesod, Ad Sheyeh Be'erech Liyas Mokel Liyesh. Till that energy. Think again, the teacher, he's taking his energy and now applying it to the student. The author is taking the ideas and manifesting them in words. The same with the artist on the canvas. This idea that that's Atzilus. So what he's summing up here is really this whole picture of the process of how it all began in Atzmus. God chose two types of Ohr, but there it's all Misyachid, it's all one. Then what happens is the Tzmtzum will separate and discern the two. So now two tracks will develop. The first track, which is the higher level of Yichud, the second track, which relates to existence. In truth is, in their source, they're one. Our job is to reconnect it all and bring it back to that source. Just to round it out. Okay. So what you see here, and this is what I honestly didn't have a chance to, I wanted to review the class I gave before Sukkot, how I explained it there, but I think I think if I recall, I did uncover that there's a little more going on here that meets the eye. But I still need more time to review that. I didn't have a chance. But I think this so far, it's clear. These two tracks. And that's what he's bringing from the Geras HaKedesh. Okay. Yeah. V'hinei. And now, this bar le'il. Are there any questions? Let me stop if there are any questions. Let's first do that. Okay, V'hinei nizbar le'il. And now, it was explained earlier in the Maimer Dibra Masl Mereish Surim. This goes back to volume 1 as a note below page 291. The Bishtalshus Ilav Ol, the Esses Firis, Yesh Beis Madreges. So he's still explaining here this process of how the ayin, ultimately after the Tzmtzum, goes through levels until it becomes appropriate to be a moked to the yesh. So the ayin of the yesh hanivra. We're not talking about the ayin of the yesh hamiti now, even though that's the higher level. We're talking about the lower level. That the ishtalshus of ilav ol, the cause and effect of the esses spheres, there's two levels. Again, we already learned in this. So I'll just be a little briefer. One is mashul tzedach atzilus. One is what is necessary for atzilus. Let's go back to the example. The teacher himself, even before he begins to transmit to the student, in himself, he needs to create a structure. Because he's going to ultimately be teaching. Like we spoke, like dibur sheba machshava. It's still all within the thought of the teacher. But in the thought, he's already preparing how he's going to present. But it's all the tzedach atzilus. It's still within the mashpia, the atzilus. And the second part, mashul tzedach biyah. That the Jessus spheres have another element. What he's preparing, what's necessary to convey to biyah, which would be the next stage of communication. So in other words, there's an internal process within the mashpia, within Atzilus, and there's a second part of the ishtalshus of the spheres that you're designating to who you're going to be mashpia to. The Letzerech Atzilus Atzmai, on the first level, Hakolu B'chinas Hadveikus. There, everything is in a state of joined together. Dveikus is attachment. Uletzerech B'yah, by contrast, Hinei B'Atzilus Gufa Ilivolu B'chinas Havdalah. Even though it's still within the Mashpiyah, within Atzilus, but relatively speaking, it's already how in Atzilus is beginning to so-called create something for outside of Atzilus. Achu be'erechli is b'chinas makir, to the point that it should become a source for the hashpah into biyah. But it's all within Atzilus. As discussed at length elsewhere. And I wonder what the parentheses is adding. He just said in his Bar Le'il that it was explained in the Maimer Kimeresh Surim. So obviously he's saying that there's another place where this is discussed at length. Perhaps even more than in the Maimer Bereish Surim, just to point that out. Okay. And now the Rebbe Rashab brings it back to what we've been learning. So what do we have established here? That, and this most likely why he brings these two levels, is to show us that even in Elamus, not just that there's the level of Pnimius that remains, so to speak, before the Tzmtzum or let's say the Chatzmei, it's only for God. It's only God's expression. that level is also comes into Ishtalshlus. However, it remains removed, like you just said, Tveikus in Atzilus. So this is now not the two levels that we spoke about how it is lifting at Tzimtzum. Before the Tzimtzum, what you have is they're both as one, both levels of Ohr, because they're both connected, because they're both formed two ayin that originate from the same source, and they're all miyuchad. The Tzimtzum is what separates and allows us to see two tracks. In Atzilus, these two tracks take on the shape. One is like Zoh, the Ohr, and one is like the Keli. Or the way he's putting it here, one is Letzerech Atzilus Atzmei, which is Dveikus, and one is Letzerech Biyah, which is Havdalah, within Atzilus itself. So obviously he's talking already here now, as it's manifesting in Seder Shtalshlus. Via Shleimer, and we can say, the Metchilahu Beze Fani Hamshachas Me'ein Sof Baruch Hu. That from the beginning, there were two Efani Hamshachas, two ways, two methods of transmission from Ein Sof Baruch Hu. V'hainu, and that means B'chinas HaRotzen, B'chinas Izgalus Er, the desire God has, there should be the revelation of light. Lo Li is B'chinas Makal Yesh. Now he's going back to the higher one. Not as a Makal Yesh, just that there should be Gilui Elikus, expression, divine expression, not catered, not tailored to anything. There, what dominates is Yichud Mamish. B'chinas Bittul b'Metzias. That's what that level represents. V'hainu b'chinas Yichud Ilah. B'chinas Yichud Ilah. In the level of Yichud Ilah. The second, Hamshacha from Ein Sof, from the same source, is V'harotzen b'Izgalus Liyes b'chinas Makal Yesh. That didn't happen later, so to speak. Both are there in the initial plan. The emergence will take place after a Tzimtzum. But in the original plan, right away, as soon as God shows to have the first level of Ohr, he also shows the second level of Ohr. And what is that level? There, we're giving more credence and more value, more identity to existence, because we want all this to be integrated into existence. So there it's a Makal Yesh, that Ohr, and that's a bitl of Yichud Tata. V'shneim heim, hamshachim b'chinas atzmus ein sof. So he's going back to what he initially said. Why there are two levels of ayin if everything is one? Because God wanted these two, and both are hamshachim from atzmus ein sof umiyuchadim in b'chinas ha'atzmus, and they're completely utterly united. To the point that they're not discernible or obvious and separate one from the other. It's purely God's will. Just the will of two different things, but it's all equally atzmus. Or canal, the b'chinas chitzenius or primius. Like we spoke earlier about chitzenius and primius. Next page, 1476. Shabbat chitzenius b'chinas hagili kamei ba primius. On that level, that which will become chitzenius, or what you could say is rooted, is just like the primius. Why should it be less atzmisdik, so to speak, than the primius? They're both equal parts of the plant. And remember, the primius, the Ohr, that does not relate to existence, is not closer to atzmus. It just doesn't have anything else but atzmus in mind. Like Eined Movad, like he says, Yichud Elah, Bittul b'Metzias. But it's not like closer to atzmus is not Ohr. And we learned earlier that Ohr does not define atzmus. The Ohr, however, doesn't have anything but atzmus. Where the second level of Ohr takes into consideration, once after the Tzimtzum happens, it becomes actualized, that it should relate to and engage with existence. So Kamoy Kain, b'chinas hagili lahavas hayesh, hu miyuchad ba'atzmus ein sof. So the gili, to create the yesh, the Ohr, that will be manifest, to become iyu v'chayu ichad, iyu v'gamu ichad, is miyuchad ba'atzmus ein kamei b'chinas hagili shalamayla me'isavos. So that which enters existence is just like the gili, like that's higher than Isav. That kol b'chinas harotzen da'atzmus ein sof. Because everything is the rotzen of atzmus ein sof, and when you focus on the rotzen, it really makes no difference. It's like what Chassidic says, and this I did mention, that from rotzen, b'chinas rotzen, it's no difference one mitzvah or another. Asher kedushan mitzvah v'tzivanu. The servant serves the master. Doesn't make a difference what he's asking you to do. If he wants you to chop wood, that's what you do. It's not defined by what you're doing. It's defined whether you're fulfilling God's will, which of course is the concept that if you're doing what Hashem wants, that's your job. It's not measured by comparing it to someone else's job. In the thing that you're doing, you're completely fulfilling Atzmus Ratzon, equal. I'm speaking it more in Avedic terms. There's that letter that I've cited a number of times from Tafshin Tes from the Rebbe, where he explains what is Eir Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. What does it mean there are no levels there? So the Rebbe explains that there everything's Ratzon Hashem. There's another level where Hashem says, I want you now, this mitzvah is to put on tefillin, tzitzis, sukkah, lulav, the dal minim, etc. Whatever other mitzvah. That's already the oyer that relates to structure. But from the point of view of Atzmus, there's a certain equality, because it's all Ratzon, the Atzmus ain't sof. On the other hand, by idea Tzimtzum, because Hashem does want levels, so to make sense of all of this, God said, but I will create a tzimtzum. And the tzimtzum will actually give distinction between these levels. But always know that in its source, in its root, it's all my Ratzon. Even the Ratzon for tzimtzum, even though he doesn't say this here, but even the Ratzon for tzimtzum is also part of the Ratzon Atzmus. And I believe I explained that what this really is leading up to is that when we speak to the Nefesh Habamis, we're not just going to tell the Nefesh Habamis, hey, you were created by an ayin liyesh, and there's an ayin that's giving you life every moment that you're dependent on. But the truth is that life that's giving you chayis is one with atzmus, just like the light that's higher than Nefesh Habamis altogether, higher than all the levels of existence. All this is going to be ultimately part of how the Nefesh Halakish trains the Nefesh Habamis to accept and love v'hafta v'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha, and not just Yichud Tata, even Yichud Elah, and ultimately, as they join as one in Atzmus, like he's describing here. I'm just giving a preview of what's coming. But the point so far has been that there are the two levels, but the two levels from the outset, but the two levels go through a process before you can actually distinguish and see them in a real way. And that's what the Tzimtzum's role is. But if you really go trace it back, it's all comes from one place, and they're completely miyuchad, pnimis achitzenius, and we have to work our way back. We can't jump from existence to this level of bittul mitzias, or the level of the highest level of yichud. We go first bittul hayesh and bittul mitzias and all the levels, and then we come to understand that bittul hayesh and bittul mitzias, both levels of ayin, are coming from the same source, and are miyuchad in asmus. So there are plenty of levels to go through to get to this awareness. And this is where we stopped before the Yom Tov, before Sukkot as well. I thought it was worthwhile going over again and understanding it all. So essentially, the last few paragraphs have been, it all goes back to what he began on page 1474, that in Kel Deus Havaya, it's all one. Then he asked, then why there are two levels of ayin? And he explained because that Atzmus wants two levels of ayin. He explained in the language with the example of the teacher and the student, the Mashpia Makabel, in the context of Primius and Chitzenius. And these both levels are both ultimately, both exist, both are equal in its source, but then through the Tzimtzum, they become separate. That's the essential point. I still want to understand better the Omnam Kan HaKavona, but for that, again, I want to do a little more review, and I'll get back to explain that more. But the general gist is what I've just described. So, any questions? Yeah.
I have a question that feels like it needs to be asked. Although he did say the very last thing he read, Al Yidei Tzimtzum Shenivdalim v'Nichlakim Zeh Mizeh. So these two types of Elikus, of divine infinite light, are coming from the same source, but because of the Tzimtzum, they become differentiated and seemingly different. Regarding the chitzonius, the or that relates to the creation, it's, as we read elsewhere in Chassidus, it's so infinitely diminished compared to where it originated from that it seems almost like of a different. It is. I understand it. Isn't it of a different qualitative nature? I mean, it's one thing to say it's sourced in the same place, but its actual presentation, its actual the way it manifests or doesn't, because if it seems to it's behester, it's qualitatively and dimensionally different. We hear to go from one level to the next. It's an infinite jump, right? And then we talk about all these
exactly what the Tzimtzum. That's exactly the role and purpose of the Tzimtzum, to have that infinite jump or quantum leap or paradigm shift, whatever you want to call it. Exactly right. And just go back to the example: the teacher and the student. They're infinitely apart, but for the teacher to transmit to the student in the nimshal here, for the oir to get to the makablim, to be a kav, you needed Tzimtzum. And if there was no Tzimtzum, that doesn't mean in God's intention there isn't a kav, but it's all encompassed. It's like everything is beneath water. God didn't separate on day 2 the water and the land. There's still land, but the land is completely submerged in the water. Think of it that way. So in the plan, you have the idea, but now you need to execute it and bring it into action. The Tzimtzum is what, in a sense, conceals that intense oil that there can emerge an oil that can relate to a student. Like you'll see, there are teachers that are so brilliant and they have brilliant things to say, but they don't have the power of Tzimtzum, that when they speak, they either overwhelm you or it's complete confusion, because what you're just hearing is a flow of their consciousness without it being catered, spoon-fed, if you wish, to the Makablim. So Tzimtzum plays that tremendous role. That's why I said, for the kavanah of existence to be fulfilled, it's the only way to do it that makes sense. God could do anything again. It could be a miracle. He can do anything he wants. But for a way that we should understand it and we should be able to reverse the process or retrace the steps, this is the process. Correct.
Is this yes? Is this where you gave a mashal?
Remember, l'mayla aden ketz and mata aden tachlis. Just as God has the capacity to is higher and higher and completely removed, he also has the capacity to relate and take the energy and allow it to go down to each particular level, down to this world, where every leaf and every fiber of existence has divine energy that is catered to it. Like we learned earlier, the mazel, the kol ace of every blade of grass has its mazel that tells it to grow, etc. So that's the asara ma'amoros nivra elam, as we've discussed. Yeah.
Did you give the mashal in the before we broke for the holiday? In this, when you gave this over, here's the question: Does in the mashal of the student, the teacher, and the student, you said at some point, like the student can actually become of the same understanding as the teacher, and perhaps even surpass in some instances. And so,
of course, I discussed it at length.
Yeah,
I discussed it at length, but that's already through avodah. Now we're talking creation, the creation process. Through avodah, that's called when we take this world and we transform it, and we educate a nefesh habamis. Then we elevate and we start growing, literally like mutfa murgish muskel, the child that grows and expands their mind, their containers, to receive more oir and oir. I spoke about samach vav, that it's not just you get back to the oir before the tzimtzum, and then even new levels of oir. Yes, I absolutely discussed it. I don't remember exactly which class, but one of the classes.
Thank you. I was just trying to
Yeah.
scratch off those neurons as well.
Yeah. I want to
Because we're going.
stop.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm going to stop here because I have to run to Everest, to be honest. So if you have any further questions, well, let's hold it till next class, if you don't mind. Okay?
Yes,
Is that all right?
100%. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we're stopping here, top of page 1476. Again, review, but still always worthwhile reading and learning.